So that's the best thing I can say about that. Now, going to RBS, I mean, I am not a big fan of the idea of let banks collapse, because if banks collapse, you might say, well, support the individual account holders, but how do you do that? What it means is effectively, suddenly, all that money in the individual accounts, let's say there's X billion, and we've all got maybe 50 grand, which, that's a notional sum in there, it just suddenly becomes cash. It's not capital anymore, the government has to find it. But remember, in a bank, there's only 4% of that there at any one time. The other 96% has been invested in other things, including things like subprime. So how are you going to get it back? The government can't stand behind, even though it theoretically says it does, it can't stand behind your 50 grand, my 50 grand, because it hasn't got it. I mean, as we now know, RBS's liabilities come to about 3 times UK GDP. It's several trillion pounds worth. I can't remember exactly how much. So they would argue the best way to do it is to bail the bank out. That is, you keep it going as a bank, that the money in it is capital, it's still circulating, but the problem I have with it, and it's not a party political problem, it's simply, as you point out, the functional problem that if you've got on the one hand a policy of saying we must keep British industry car firms going by giving them loans, and then on the other hand you've got banks owned by the government that are actually saying we're not going to give you any loans because you're not worthy of the loans, it would be all too easy to sort it by saying, and I've had senior bond traders in the city say to me, just take RBS's money and lend it all to British industry. That's what you should be doing. Instead, you see it with Obama and GM, there's this obsession about not having control, that the state should never own things, because that's a hangover from the neoliberal ideology. And then, sadly and accidentally, we have to own most of the banking system. But we don't want to control it. Well, who's controlling it? Because under capitalist norms, the shareholder control it. You're not telling me that the 10% of ordinary private shareholders left in RBS control it. So if the government doesn't control it, nobody controls it. The management control it. And the management, by definition, are a bunch of people who wouldn't normally be controlling it, because if they'd been good enough to control it, they would have been doing it to start with. These are people who've been brought in, Gordon Brown's friends, Stephen Hester, etc. So you've got a huge part of British capitalism not controlled by anybody. And I don't think that's functional for capitalism, let alone moral or whatever. It's just not functional. It's not functional for the small Midlands widget factory, because they should be getting the credit, and they find it incredibly difficult at the moment. Your question about CDS, there's 56 trillion. Well, obviously, the thing about that is that they waged everything up. It was like a massively leveraged bet. And the interesting thing has been that they've been able to, in a controlled way, deleverage that. Okay. Now, indicating that a lot of it was notional anyway, and that they were able to decommit to these bets easier than they were to the much more real bets on housing. Those are the bets where they lost money. If you're thinking about it in betting terms, these are bets where the slightly embarrassed punter and the slightly embarrassed bookie have been able to go, let's just forget it, wiping trillions down in the process that never existed. What this tells me is something that the lefties among you might not be so keen to hear. I don't think derivatives were a big problem in this crisis. Derivatives sound a terrible moral crime that 17 times world GDP circulates in the form of foreign exchange derivatives alone, and that 56 trillion worth of derivatives exist. But I think derivatives are only like the velocity of money. They can be good, they can be bad, they can be a scam or not a scam. But I don't argue that derivatives caused the crisis. I think there is actually a logic in Bernanke's argument that the highly derivative and complex part of financial capitalism did in some ways, in some parts, help stability. I think you could say about half of foreign exchange is functional to the economy and half of it is a gamble. This is the forex market is the biggest derivative market in the world. But I don't want to expand too heavily on that, but I think that's my hunch. It affects how I think the solution could come out, because we're not talking solutions yet, but I think there will be a place for a derivativized, highly complex form of finance capitalism. It'll just have to be started from the point of view of if it could crash the system, it's not allowed. and won't, or if it wants to be allowed, then the first people who lose their money when it goes wrong are the people running it. So one very simple reform that's been suggested that is still in the system to be thought about is that all investment banks, all hedge funds, just have to be partnerships, and you just have to lose everything first yourself. It still doesn't solve the problem that if you could take a bet that could crash the system, what do you do? And that means that, in answer to the other question about regulation, well, we'll leave aside money laundering. I'm aware of the cases you talk about, but I'm not really aware of how it ended up. I certainly was following that, and it never really seemed to end up right. But let's take the general issue of regulation. Regulation just has to change. The game changes. Because if you want macro-prudential regulation, as it's called, that is to stop all these bubbles happening that crash the system, then you can't rely on the principles that the FSA was founded on, which are self-regulation. Inside every bank, I met this guy, Paul Moore, in HBOS. He became a whistleblower in one of my reports. His job was to be the eyes and ears of the FSA in HBOS. He said, we're taking massive risks, we're taking risks that are unconscionable. He was sacked. But his only job was to say to the bosses, we're taking too many risks, and they sacked him. No, you can't have that. You can't even have the system working as it would have worked had they not sacked him. Because what you need to do, it's not a problem about is HBOS taking too many risks and ripping off a few customers. The issue is, can HBOS crash the system? And therefore you've got to be, it's got like being, kind of primary school teacher. I've got to be wandering around looking what's on the desk, I've actually got to kind of open the desk and see what's in it, in case it's a sort of your Stanley knife. That's what I've got to do. I used to be a teacher, by the way. That's what I've got to do. I can't be going, guys, is there anything wrong? Is everybody all right? That's not the way it works. And people say, well, you can't make regulation work, because if you make regulation work, then they'll always find a way around it. And this is a good argument, and it's an argument that we have to take on board, because if you were the government now, that'd be your problem. How do you regulate in a way that they can't get around? Well, and the other argument is that the banks are always more clever than regulators. And it's not just like an accident, but because systemically they can always hire and be one step hire cleverer people and be one step ahead always. So the regulators always running out. Funnily enough, coppers don't have this problem. You don't meet many geniuses in the police force, and they don't have to be more clever than criminals. Point is, they put them in jail, and in America, they shoot them. Okay, so if you fear China, which is the strongest and most authoritarian, kind of legal system in the world, doesn't have much crime. This is very funny, isn't it? How come the Chinese criminals don't just outwit the police all the time, or one step ahead of them? Because in China, you're drug dealing, you're hung or shot. Now, I don't advocate shooting or hanging bankers, but I do advocate, if you're going to regulate capitalism if you're going to say macro-prudential regulation, that you've just got to put people in jail who break the law. It's got to become a matter of criminal law. So there you go.